Today is Friday, June 28th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here once again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, we had our first commenting. What did you note in the comments down below?
One, I just appreciate that everybody did. Thank you guys. Well, I say everybody. It wasn't everybody. Clearly, there were hundreds of people that listened, and there were maybe 20 or so.
25.
25? Okay, that was really nice. I did notice, but part of it was a test, which IT asked us to do to see if we got an email notification. And we got one email notification for one of those comments and didn't get notifications on the rest. They're not entirely sure why, but they have a ticket open. So until that's resolved, and in fact, even maybe it's never be resolved. You know, we're kind of dependent on YouTube here. But I'm going to go out every once in a while to the queue and make sure that there's anything that if anything builds up that's posted. But it was wonderful to hear from you. Yeah. Very, very positive. Thank you very much.
All over the world. We heard from several in Australia, a number in Barbados. We had also the UK, Guyana, the Philippines. Let's see where else? Trinidad. Of course, Texas, another foreign country. Another Barbados, Florida. Let's see what else. Kentucky, Tri-Cities, and Washington. Another Barbados, Colorado, Michigan, and that's it.
Wow! A shout out to Barbados, really representing there. Appreciate you guys. That is pleasantly spread. That's very nice. Yeah.
We'll have to make a trip down there.
Hey, that sounds good. And if we missed yours by any chance, we were just kind of looking at the actual list that we saw. But thank you to all of you. It was actually really encouraging.
It was really neat to hear.
Yeah, it was.
Know where people are listening from and everything encouraging. Mr. Smith, it's been a lot going on here at headquarters lately, and one thing in particular that's notable. What is going on here that's inspired our podcast topic today? Yeah.
Well, as mentioned in the announcements, Mr. Richard Ames is in the hospital these days, and it got me and Mr. Robinson both thinking in terms of respecting our elders. It's a very important biblical principle, and it's not a lot of that going on out there in the world, but for our teens and young adults, you hear us talk about it here in the church on occasion in sermons and such. And the more we thought about it, the more we thought, this would actually be a worthy topic. So today we're going to talk about respecting your elders.
Respecting your elders, especially as you and I are getting slowly more elderly.
Hey, all the more important.
That's right.
And we're back. And yeah, we don't really have much of an update, just so you know, this week on Mr. Ames. I think Mr. Weston, what he put out recently is kind of still the case. Yeah. Mr. Ames is still in the hospital in serious condition, but stable condition. So anyway, we hope for the best, and had the chance to actually stop by a couple of days ago. Mr. DeSimone and I went by, so we're going by and visiting. But it did get us really mindful these days. Mr. Robinson and I have been reminiscing a bit, and we've had the chance to work with Mr. Ames for so long, and I know when I went to go visit with him, talk about what a privilege it's been to have my office right next to him, kind of hear him come in, and the idea of respecting your elders, it's not just an old saying. The Bible clearly emphasizes it in a profound way, and it's important all the more because what's our audience here for Living Youth? The title is kind of a cue, right? It's for our teens and our young adults, which means that if we're teens and young adults, then we have quite a few elders in the church. And we're not just talking about the ministry. We're talking about those who have lived longer than we have. We're talking about those who are older than we have, than we are. And the Bible actually has a direct command related to such things in the book of Leviticus. And so this is kind of the motivating verse for our discussion today. And it's clearly important. It's right after God talks about Leviticus 19. Don't mess with mediums or familiar spirits, and don't do that. He's talking about things that matter a great deal to him. But then he says in verse 32 of Leviticus 19, verse 32, he says, "You shall rise before the grayheaded and honor the presence of an old man and fear your God. I am the eternal." And I got to admit, I kind of have a soft spot for the for the old King James here, because it uses this word which we won't use all that often, where it says, "Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head." The hoary head just sounds like a great name for a book, or I don't know, a band album. But and honor the face of an old man, and fear thy God. I am the eternal. And, I've heard it mentioned here actually heard it at camp when I've gone. I remember hearing Mr. Jonathan McNair talk about it. Definitely heard it here. I've even talked with Mr. Ames about it and Mr. Weston about it. But this idea that we should honor the elderly, it really is important, especially in a world here where, honestly, it seems like there's less. Honest, part of the controversy during the COVID days, right, was it seemed like they were taking some sick elderly people and then putting them in nursing homes with a bunch of other elderly people. This idea that, well, no, there's this very special privilege that we should afford in various ways to our elderly. So that was on our mind for this podcast today.
Yeah, and I was thinking about how you pointed out there was a number of things grouped together here, and as I've learned to approach the Bible and my experience has grown, and you start to get a better feel for how God emphasizes things, it's actually quite notable to me that God does lump some of these things together, because I think it's the kind of thing that's easy to underestimate its importance to God.
Yeah.
So sometimes the way he does that is sticks something like that in with other things that everybody gets is a big deal. And to emphasize that, no, the respect for the elders is as big a deal to me as these other things. I think that's one way you could look at it.
Yeah.
I think that's at least fair. But anytime God says, "I am the Lord," that we should always take note of that. That God's placing a really, again, easy to overlook what an emphasis he's putting on it. And I'll tell you, growing up when I was young, and I'm just, so for example, my daughter Maddie is much different than I am in this regard. She's very aware of where she's come from and her past, and thinks about her future all the time. Well, growing up, I didn't pay any particular attention to all that. I didn't think about the future. I only thought about where I was at that point in life. But as I've grown older, I've really grown to appreciate things like that, and then how much value you gain from people who've lived for a while and have experienced some things, and they've been through some things. And that's why when you started talking about this as our topic, I thought, yes, this would be a good one to hit, because young teenage John Robinson would not have understood why it was important, but especially why it's important to God.
That's a great way to put it, because I don't think any of our listeners would think, well, we don't want to be rude to older people, of course. It's like, well, of course, and we want to be kind. And, often as you get older, you get more frail. I'm certainly more frail than my boys at this point. But it really is that other aspect. And again, what is the theme? We bring this up every once in a while. What's the theme of this whole podcast? It's about thinking biblically, like not just trying to analyze things with our smarty brains, or I would say logic or something, but specifically trying to think biblically. And, our kind of dialogue here just a moment ago kind of got me looking at these. And one, you're right about God saying, "I am the eternal and I am the Lord." In this passage in Leviticus 19, he says that so many times. But it really is interesting how he does seem to kind of match some things up. Like right before that, in verse 31, he talks about not giving regard to mediums or familiar spirits. Don't seek after them. It's important to know that he is the eternal. That is, I'm the one you're supposed to worship. You don't get into all this other spiritualism stuff. If you go to the verse below that, actually the next two, it's verses 34 and 35, he's talking about treating strangers well. And those who weren't born in your land, right? But treating those who have come into your land well. And he reminds them that he is God, and that they also need to remember you were strangers.
Mm-hmm.
You need to keep that in mind. He every once in a while with these, he kind of throws in a bit of that kind of justification, about a little bit of explanation why. Sometimes your parent just says, "Do it." And sometimes they explain a little bit about why. Well, in this particular case, in verse 32, he does seem to associate these things. You shall rise before the grayheaded and honor the presence of an old man and fear your God. I am the eternal. Well, it's interesting that he lumps that in. It's as if he's equating these things, that rising before the grayheaded, honoring the presence of an old man, and fearing your God, it's as if these things kind of go together, as if it's so important to him that to fail to show honor to those who are older, those who are the elderly, those who are the aged, is very much connected with failing to honor God Himself. And I think it's very interesting that there's that association there. That when God's, it's kind of like, if I see one of my children disrespected, well, I do take that a bit personally. If that happens, I just feel like, hey, because they're part of my family. You've done that to them, but it's like you've done that to me. Kind of like what Christ talks about when He says, when you've fed, someone who's hungry, when you visit a church member who's in jail, and you've done that with me. It's almost like God is kind of associating these things that, well, to fail to honor the elderly is to fail to fear me in some kind of way.
Yeah.
And I think that connection is meaningful.
So then what would you say about somebody who treats it lightly or doesn't understand its significance? What are some of the downsides to a person like that? Like what are their consequences they suffer?
Like for making that mistake.
Yeah, for making that mistake.
Well, it's interesting. There's a verse that it never comes to mind, so I took time to look it up. I mean, it comes to mind, but I never really can think of where to find it. I just tend to remember it's in Job somewhere.
Yeah.
And I did actually find it this time.
I feel like you're Job's biggest fan. I've never seen a bigger fanboy of Job in all my life. It's so fun. That's a good example of like how very different approaches. I'm kind of the other way around. I'm like, what's with Job? But does it need to be that long? What's with all,
Yeah, I am a fan of Job. And in Job 35, there's this bit of advice that Elihu, and it's good advice because Elihu's giving it. The other guy's advice isn't always bad. Their problem was it just didn't apply to Job, really. They actually say some true things.
So that's a good way to contextualize it? Because I know people wonder sometimes, do we just discount what the other guy said?
See, it's difficult because they clearly say some things that are true. But some have tried to say, well, maybe they were even listening to demons or something like that. It's like, wow, maybe in some cases, because definitely the demons were delighted Job was suffering. But it's not just that. To take this brief side quest, part of the lesson of those three guys, it's a humbling lesson because they said some things that are even scriptural. And sometimes we can be so full of ourselves and be giving someone advice, and it's scriptural, and we feel confident about it, and we might be missing the point that is not actually the advice God would be giving, and we might be misapplying that passage or applying a passage in someone's life when really a totally different passage would apply best. And so, their advice, their main thing was they were just certain, they were convinced in their heart that Job had actually sinned in some way, and this is why he's being punished. This is me oversimplifying perhaps, but as a result, they start gathering, if you will, biblical ideas, certain truths based on that assumption, and apply that to Job, and they just don't apply, and yet they're convicted as if they're talking like in God's place Himself. Well, Elihu is the one who gets it right, and it's sort of a worthwhile example to bring up here to make sure it doesn't contradict, because Elihu is the youngest of them. In fact, Elihu was deferring to the older fellas to speak first. But I would highlight that is not to contradict anything we're saying today, because Elihu is an exemplar in that regard, because he says up front, hey, I deferred, because he should have. He recognized that. I deferred to you guys because you guys were older. I'm younger. But the only reason he finds a place to be able to speak up is he says, but there is a spirit that God gives us, right? He was actually speaking spiritual truths that God had given him and moved in that particular circumstance. So there was a humility. If Elihu had actually started off like, man, I'm so glad all you old guys finally stopped talking so I could get in there. I mean, it would have completely changed the demeanor of what he was saying. But here's one of the things that God uses Elihu to say to Job. And this ties, believe it or not, this is tied to what you were saying, Mr. Robinson, which is what difference does it make? In terms of whether we respect those who are older or not. I think it's a very practical difference for us. In Job 35 and verse 6, Elihu says, if you sin, what do you accomplish against him, that is God? Or if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him, right? What difference does it make to him? Now, what difference does it make doesn't mean he doesn't care. Rather, how does it impact God's life in some way? This is verse 7. And if you're righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? He says, your wickedness, verse 8, affects a man such as you, and your righteousness a son of man. And first time I can't know if it's the first time I heard it, but I remember years ago hearing it, at least taking note of it. is that, well, yeah, that's right. That, in the end, whether I'm in the kingdom of God or not, or whether I'm thrown in the lake of fire or not, God is still going to be God. And there's going to be this family of his that I get to be a part of or not. That it's not like my doing the right thing somehow makes God stronger. Oh, thank you. You've given me more power. Or my doing the wrong thing somehow weakens
Yeah.
God. No, he's still God. He wants me. So therefore, why is he so invested in my obeying the commands he gives me? It's because he knows it's what's best for me. He knows that obeying him is part of what is shaping me and making me more Christ-like and making
Yeah.
Christ's mind far more accessible to me and making my mind more like Christ. And that applies here too. We can know with certainty that if God feels so passionate about you need to respect your elders, you need to respect those who are elderly, those who've lived longer than you. If he feels that way, then it's for our benefit. That is, we grow by doing so. Our mind on the world changes. We're thinking more like God does. And on the contrary, if we're not doing that, if we're failing to respect those, like Paul says, honor to whom honor is due. If we're failing to give that honor, then we can know assuredly that we're thinking less like God in those moments. Our character is being damaged and not helped. Our perspective on other things, I would dare say probably our perspective on authority in general is not that. And it's not unusual that I've seen those who tend to be too quick to dismiss those who are older.
Yep.
Wow, those old guys, that's what they think.
Yeah.
It's not a coincidence. That also tracks with a lack of respect for authority in general.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that was very good. And it made me think about even more practically that individual. What do they lose out on?
Right.
And which kind of leads us into our next point. So for example, Mr. Ames, I'll turn 53 here soon.
So young.
Let's leave it that. And so as long as I've been alive, and I know this is just common sense, but just follow me, hear me out. Mr. Ames has been alive my entire life, and I've worked with him directly or indirectly the last 12 years, and he's just been like this. I don't even want to make an analogy because I'm afraid some could construe it as potentially even disrespectful, because I was kind of thinking about the Energizer Bunny, just he keeps going and going, and after a while you begin to think that he's just going to go on forever, and you don't even think about a time without Mr. Ames being there, or any long-term pillar in the community. They're just always there. They're just always accessible. They're making, like in Mr. Ames in particular, to just a few months ago, still writing scripts and articles, contributing to the work at 88. I was, he's doing more at 88 than I did when I was in my 30s,
Yeah.
And so it's just incredible. But then one day you're hit with the idea that suddenly he's not there. Suddenly a pillar in your community is gone. And what have you lost? Well, you've lost a lot. You've lost somebody who remembers how things used to be. So an example of that was, there's a couple times I've seen him, Mr. Ames, in action, as it were. And one time I can remember was fairly recent, was in a lunch meeting with a number of the other ministers, and they were talking about how to maybe handle something. And I noted Mr. Ames always had the context of how things were done back decades ago. And there was a real value to that, because many things were established in worldwide that serve us to this day. And to have somebody who remembered how something came to be and why informed decisions we were making to this very day. And, if when Mr. Ames eventually goes to sleep, that reservoir of knowledge and understanding and a recollection of the history is just gone. And so here's an example. I wonder how many of our listeners will be our older listeners in this case would remember this, but over the last 3 or 4 years, as tech has become bigger and bigger and a bigger part of our lives and a bigger part of the whole world and becoming more and more valuable, well, tech keeps moving pretty fast. And so soon tech companies were not valuing the older employees anymore. And they were older and they made more money. And boy, they're going to want retirement and all this stuff. So, as an example, just IBM alone forced out over a 5-year period 20,000 employees age 40 and over.
Wow.
And I don't know about you, but I never considered 40 like an old. And I could kind of understand as you're getting into your 60s and an older employee, you might be thinking about that might seem older, but 40s is not old,
right?
And so they forced a bunch out. But what happened was, and a lot of these tech companies didn't value the older employees, forced them out by either outright laying them off or forced retirement, and many of them were pressured into some kind of long-term format where eventually they quit, and they didn't value the older employees, and they just wanted a younger, more cost-effective workforce. But IBM learned, and who knows how deeply they learned it, but there was at least some admittance to this. Other companies such as Hewlett-Packard and Google and others. So the tech community in general over the past 2 years has forced out 400,000 older employees.
Wow.
And older in tech terms can mean 35 and up. Well, what they found out was all the people with all the experience and knew how things worked were now gone.
Wow.
And it really impacted them, whether even if it was maybe somebody made a calculus, it was still worth it because they were saving money. It did impact their company and their culture to lose the older employees. I know in many other cultures, like the in the U.S., the Native American and the Plains Indians deeply valued their oldest members of their community. In some ways, the most widely regarded,
right?
Because they had the experience. They remember how things used to be. They remember that old river that dried up, or something like important information that helped inform the tribe to that very day. And the loss of somebody who's old and been around can be felt in ways you don't necessarily anticipate.
Right. Thank you for putting it that way, because you think the tech companies, that'd be an exception. You really want the younger, they're the closest, but honestly, not necessarily, right? It's not like the older employees got there and just stopped learning. I mean, a lot of them still learn, but also a lot of those timeless principles, they're not the principles you can gain by taking a new coding class or just learning, it's actually, look, I may have learned this on Python, I say C++. I remember when that was the thing, but the principles are still principles, let alone the arcane knowledge you need about your company itself that only experience there with your customer base, et cetera, is going to make a difference. To me, it's things like that, details like that add to a proverb. There's a proverb, chapter 20 verse that I really enjoy, and it seems kind of so simple on its surface, but I find the more I meditate on it, the more it means something to me. Maybe it's as grayer heads are showing up here in my own coif. I doubt I've got the kind of hair that qualifies as a coif, Mr. Robinson. But in Proverbs chapter...
Let me look it up.
Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 29, it says, "The glory of young men is their strength, and the splendor of old men is their gray head." Now, I like this because it gives its props to both sides of the border, whichever side of the border you happen to think you're on. It is awesome to be young and strong. I look back at my young days, and I remember hearing a comedian talk about how this is the way it's going to be, and you don't realize it. But they say, yeah, you're going to be dissatisfied about your life and your body when you're younger. You're going to get older and look back and think, man, that was great. I was in great shape. Look at that. Look at me. I'm running and jumping, whatever the case is. And while I never really had like a Captain America kind of physique, at the same time, yeah, I was fit. I did. I ran. I honestly, sometimes it was hard to walk because I just loved running. I would get places. I remember when I first kind of fractured my kneecap. It was because of a jump I probably shouldn't have done, but I just wanted to do it. And when it comes to being young, there's a wonderful strength that God has given to your body. That is a privilege. It's wonderful, and you bet. Mr. Meredith used to talk about when he was young. You're looking in the mirror, and you're flexing. You're really concerned. Oh, wow, what that muscle could be bigger. But eventually, you transition. It's not so much anymore. In fact, there's a few things. I got to be honest. It can be a little bit pathetic to see older men still glorying in their strength, as in that's their focus of their glorying. And so, well, no, you should have moved on to the second part of the equation here. In fact, it's a little bit weird. I had to take my wife to a doctor's appointment this morning, routine doctor's appointment, just so we all know. But we're kind of down to one card we both kind of share these days. So I'm in the waiting room for her to get her so we can switch out. She can get me here to work. It was a very early appointment. And there was an infomercial on for this ab machine. I don't want to pick on this guy, but the guy who designed it and stuff, he's like 60 or in his 60s, and man, he was cut. I mean, he had these really ripped abs, which he's selling an ab machine that he designed. But there was also just a bit of unusualness to it. I mean, it'd be nice to be 60 and be fit like that guy. I'm not saying it wouldn't be. But there's also just something, I don't know, a little bit off to it. Part of it was the infomercial atmosphere, because the next thing you know, I expected to tell me how it can also spread peanut butter on one side of your bread, or keep meat cold on one side of your sandwich, and the meat hot and the vegetables cold. Okay, forget it. I'm going to move on.
Yeah, dude. Well, it depends on what kind of sandwich.
Yeah, what kind of sandwich?
If it's a hamburger, you want the cheese and the burger to be, or the
there you go, and the lettuce and the tomato to be cold. Thank you
Mm-hmm.
for trying to save me, pull me out of that hole, Mr. Robinson. But when it comes to aging, you cross a line. We call it the Proverbs 20:29 barrier, where it's not your strength that is your source of glory. It's the gray hair.
Mm-hmm.
And we live in a world where, I mean, I remember growing up with commercials that are about all the dyes they try to sell men to comb the gray out of their hair, right? And yet God says, no, that's a part of your splendor, right? That's a part. Now, he's not just saying that gray hair looks good, though, Mr. Robinson, you look pretty sharp, just so you know, and you're so much gray on Mr. Robinson, not just in your beard.
On the beard, for
yeah.
sure. It wasn't weird. That was unexpected. It was the beard to go gray, and the hair was stayed relatively stable.
That's interesting. But it's not just that it might look sharp. That's not what God's talking about. That gray hair means something. You don't get gray hair unless you dye it gray, which almost nobody is doing, or you've lived a life that has been packed with experiences, and that gray hair symbolizes your ability to comment intelligibly, rooted in facts, rooted in experience, that those who haven't earned that gray, you talk about earning gray hair, that they just haven't earned yet. And so just like the old should be able to look at the young and appreciate, man, that guy's fast, or, oh, I can't believe, he made that 3-point shot from so far away, or whatever things you want to come up with. On the other hand, the young should be able to look at the older and recognize that gray hair means something, right? There's lessons that guy or that gal has learned that I just haven't. And that is something to be envied. And let me confess, I didn't appreciate it enough when I was younger.
Yeah.
I was pretty sold on my own intelligence. Oh, straight A's, and look at me. Here's science, here's math, here's all these things, and really, full of myself to hopefully not some degree that almost everybody around me recognized I was. But I can look back now and realize how much I was oversold on my own opinion, when now I wish I could slap myself a bit and say, hey, why don't you ask your grandfather about his take on that? Why don't you go ask your mom and dad? When now I'm at a point where I wish I had done that, and nobody's available anymore. Everybody above me on the family tree is gone.
Yeah, no, 100%. I was exactly the same way, and it's funny. It's kind of an irony that sometimes it's not until you yourself get older that you start to realize how valuable that was, and you wish you could still consult. My father died in 2006, I think. And I don't think regularly I wish I could ask him about stuff, but I definitely from time to time think, I'd be kind of interested in get my dad's perspective on this, or see what he remembers about something, which kind of, to me, leads into my other practical reason for why respecting the elderly and valuing their contribution to society at large, but to our individual culture, especially the church culture. So, for example, this is a thing I've had personal experience with now, but people who are older, especially say somebody like Mr. Ames, who can look back over probably 60 years of church history.
Mm-hmm.
People who are older remember the past, And that is sometimes important. So, for example, like I'm sure you've heard or run into people who claim that during World War II that the Holocaust didn't happen or was a hoax of some point. Well, guess what? There's still people alive who were in concentration camps. Probably very few now, but people who experience World War II kind of remember the world or view the world differently than we do. And they know what the world can descend into. And it kind of feels like some of the craziness and the madness going on right now. In fact, I listened to a fantastic podcast recently where I wish I could remember the guy's name, but he was a very experienced diplomat and he'd spent time in some of the U.S. presidential administrations and had a lot of contexts. He interestingly put a lot of blame for the tension border on World War III with a group of conservatives called the neocons, and neo meaning new, right?
Right.
And so the neocons are newer, and you know what? They never went through a major world war like World War II, and he felt like they are really playing with fire because they don't understand how this thing can go, and it's worse than ever because now we have nukes, which we didn't have in World War II, at least towards the end. So it's they're playing with things that are dangerous that they don't realize how dangerous it is because they haven't experienced it before, but there are people who have. And then they're like when we talked to Mr. Weston in our podcast recently. He's a man that remembers America and the UK and Australia and Canada very differently than how it is now. He remembers a time when people went outside and there were smaller communities and there was, and then now here we are and everybody goes in their house and their air conditioning and we don't, do you know your neighbors? He knows his neighbors. And I think that's because he knows that's important. He's talked in his sermons before. But then for me personally, my final point, I've seen some things happen in the church that now I realize, there's a lot of value to somebody who kind of knows the history of the church. And in fact, before the podcast, that's why I was late, Mr. Smith, I was going around to ask a question that would have dated back to the 1970s. Okay. So I come to find there's only about 3 people in this building that would really, well, no, that's not true, because I'm not going to go bother Mr. Weston. That's an example. But I tried to find Mrs. Pyle. She's not here today. I can't remember who. Oh, and I was going to ask Mrs. Grandma McNair, Dottie McNair, and she was gone. And then I realized there's only a very small group of people that remember what happened in the 70s, if you kind of want to know a specific data point in the 70s. Okay, so this is where I started to realize Dr. Meredith used to talk about from time to time over decades, various what I'll call rebellions in the church. And by rebellion, I mean this in the broadest possible way. Somebody got upset for whatever reason and left the church. Sometimes it's more calculated, and somebody actually, like they talk about the 1970s East Coast Rebellion. That was a group of ministers that planned it out. Okay, and one of the things he pointed out was how that the split off groups or people would sometimes form or often form their own group, and over time it never amounted to anything. And so I have now witnessed that a couple times in my own life. In the mid-90s, the way some of the churches formed. And one of the bigger churches had a split, not the one everybody's thinking of. This is a different one, a local split, where the local pastor kept a lot of people. Well, I was at a funeral probably 5 years ago, something like that. And that split off had built a building big enough to hold 300 or 400 people in it. And now they're trying to sell the building because they're down to like 20 or 30 people.
Wow.
It didn't amount to anything. And that gets into a whole other podcast topic, which is the importance of doing the work. Because if you don't, your organization will eventually wither and die.
Christ calls doing the work the food of his body. And so you don't do the food. That's right.
So, we've had some things happen over the last few years where I viewed it very simply through the lens of history and understood that some of what was going on was not a good idea and that will not end in success. But what I failed to realize was younger people didn't recognize that. They'd never been through something like that before. They didn't have the experience. And sadly, a lot of them didn't listen to the people that were experienced. That would be kind of interesting to break down, why. Well, there are various reasons, but the final point on this was, I had seen some of this stuff happen and come and go, and I knew this was not a good path to go down, but other people did not. And so it's important to have people who have been around and seen things and contextualize things, because new things will pop up here and there, or at least you think they're new, and they're just a variant of things that have happened in the past.
No, you're right. That again, that bit of gray hair means something. Like if you could look closely at the gray hair, you would see the writing of little experiences that caused that gray hair to pop out, and over time. And I agree. I know. I was thinking of my sons, and yeah, they had not experienced all the things that I've experienced here and there. And say the most recent circumstance where there was a group who decided not to be here anymore. It was I don't say privilege. That's not right, but it was an opportunity for me to sit down with them and say, "Hey, look, experience has shown over the decades. Expect the following things to happen."
Yeah.
And then be able to lay out for them, expect this, expect this, expect this. And you kind of lay those things out based upon the way it always seems to go. And then, which they wouldn't know all of that. They haven't lived through those things, but then it gave them the opportunity to see, guess what? Sure enough, this happened. And then this happened. And I used to do that when the kids were much smaller, when it was a whole lot easier to say, hey guys, let me tell you what's going to happen, and it would be something really small. But I felt that predictive power kind of gave them a little more confidence in Dad. Like, oh, Dad really knows what he's doing. So you always got to be careful when you do that. But in this particular case, that's right. The church has had its little, factions, people being distracted by various things going all the way back for 2,000 years. And yet, for every generation, there's a first time. But within that generation, where there's a first time, there are those of the hoary head who've been through it before.
Yep.
That can be a resource, a source of support.
Well, so one example of that to me was some of the younger advocates for this going this other direction either told me directly or I also heard indirectly, well, this situation is just like what happened in the 90s. And let's remember that they were not born. Most of them were not born.
I know.
Okay.
I don't mean to be laughed to be cruel, but yeah, hearing that is so ridiculous. Please continue. Yeah.
Well, guess what? I was 24, 25, 26 in the mid 90s. I was there. I witnessed the whole thing. Had a kind of a front row view. Well, maybe not front row, but I was close to the stage. And I could tell you with all certainty, this is nothing like what happened back in the 90s. But how would you know unless you lived through it?
Right. Well, how would you know unless you lived through it? Or how could you be open to realizing that unless you listen to those who had actually been there and actually have something to say? So, yeah, it's interesting. One more biblical example I think that we can give before maybe we get a little practical and talk about some things is, and it's one of my favorites. I actually really used to enjoy how Mr. Agwin would bring this out about Rehoboam, and I'm not even going to pretend to do it as well as he did, but I always thought it was such a great example. And so you have the death of King Solomon. And so who's next? Well, so Rehoboam's up. Rehoboam's up as king, and he goes there to Shechem, and so he's going to be king, and he tries to get some advice about it, right? So I'm going to read from 1 Kings chapter 12, starting in verse 2. It says, "So it happened when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying," oh wait, I gotta look at this wrong. Am I getting this wrong?
Can I add context while you're looking
at it? Add context, right.
Okay. So what Mr. Smith is reading here is in the aftermath of the death of King Solomon. So King Solomon has died. His son Rehoboam has ascended to the throne, and I forget who calls the gathering, but there is a gathering where the other tribes of Israel come to King Rehoboam and make a request that he lower the taxes. And this is what you're reading is the
right. Okay, you're exactly right. That's why I was a little bit behind where I thought I would be, because they're essentially requesting exactly that. Hey, can you lower the taxes on us? It was so rough under your father, and we just like some lighter taxes. So now you have Rehoboam. He's got to figure out, well, should I do that? This is what the people are requesting. So Rehoboam takes action. In verse 6 of 1 Kings chapter 12, it says, "Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived. And he said, 'How do you advise me to answer these people?' Verse 7, and they spoke to him, these are the elders, saying, if you will be a servant to these people today and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. So they essentially said, this actually is a great opportunity for you. Your father's taxes were pretty high. Mm-hmm. Listen to them. They will love you for that. And so Rehoboam, it says in verse 8, he says, he rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. Now, this doesn't mean guys younger. These are his cohorts. This is important because if your tendency is like mine, it's very easy. The very natural thing is to go, I need some advice. So what I do, I go to people my age, just like me, right, who tend to think already very similar to me, when what experience has taught me, and thankfully I do follow what I've learned every once in a while, is like, no, I need to go to somebody older who is far more not only capable of seeing something different than the way I do, because they don't always think the way I do, but they actually have a lot more experience. It's like I remember telling a young man at camp once who was doing his best to act on some advice, was trying to help other people his age, but was not talking to people older than him. I said, look, and then he thought about talking to someone his age. And I said, look, you're talking about someone who just essentially has your same level of ignorance. Why are you looking for advice with someone with the same level of ignorance you have? Go to a local elder here. Go to a pastor. Well, Rehoboam is doing that. So he's going to the people that he grew up with now for advice. And he says to them in verse 9, what advice do you give me? How should we answer? How should we answer this people who've spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us? Verse 10, then the young men who'd grown up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you should speak to this people who've spoken to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger will be thicker than my father's waist. That's the guy who's got opulence.
Yeah. And you guys can't see it, but Mr. Smith is literally holding his pinky.
I am holding
it's
just
awesome.
kind of holding my little pinky up. So it's like I'm gonna have so much taxes and goods. I'm gonna be so fat.
Yeah.
And so he goes on. He says, now whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. And so essentially he took the young guy's advice. He didn't take the elders' advice. And really, you can imagine easily them thinking, it's like, well, no, look, man, we've put in our time. Of course, when you're young, you think you've put in your time, and then you get older and realize, oh man, I'd only started. It's like their time to rise to the throne. This is our time to shine. No, don't listen to those old guys, right? Yeah. They've already gotten theirs. It's time for you to get yours.
Somebody can fact check me on this, but I think he was in his 30s or maybe even almost 40 when he took over the throne. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's not like he's like a cocky 20-something-year-old. Like, right. He kind of should know better.
Yeah.
I always think back what because I've heard Mr. Oakwood talk about this, and he said, in fact, I find that this statement applies to many things in life. That you can expand it beyond just what he said, but he said, if you have to tell everybody you're in charge, it's a pretty good sign you're not. And that's kind of what it was. It's like, no, I'm going to show everybody I'm even more powerful than my father Solomon. And it actually is an act of weakness, frankly. So, that's a great example. And not good advice, because what happened, Mr. Smith? What was the results of that?
And indeed, the kingdom split. The people, instead of loving him and realizing, okay, wow, you're a wonderful king, they said, you know what? We're out of here. And they split the kingdom.
10 of the 12 tribes.
Lost 10 of the 12. There's a whole reason there is an Israel and a Judah and a split. We could boil it down to one thing. He did not take the advice of the hoary head, and he went with his peers in this case, which were not youngins, but compared to the old ones, they were.
So for those of you, they're going to say he lost 11 tribes. Look, I get it. But Benjamin tended to continue to be associated with Judah over the years.
Yeah,
so that's
indeed.
why I say 10 out of 12.
Indeed. That's where let's say this. That's where the 10-2 split.
Well, and a lot of the Levites ended up staying around Judah and Jerusalem.
That's true. So, okay. So here, as we're going to close, or getting close to close, we want to at least leave you with some practical things you can do. Like, what are some immediate things you can do? It's like, hey, okay, Mr. Smith, Mr. Robinson, you guys are so amazingly convincing. You and your gray hairs here and there, I'm going to listen to you. I want to honor the elderly more. I want to do something. So what are some things that you can do? Mm-hmm. Well, let me just throw one out there. And
bring us food.
That's right. it sounds kind of silly to say this, but I gotta admit, when it was first presented to me, I remember thinking, well, really, should I do that? If you go back to what it says in Leviticus 19 and verse 32, it says to rise before the grayheaded. You know what? Just there's one place to start. If your grandmother walks into the room, or your grandfather, for that matter, your father, mother, but someone older than you, and you're sitting down, take the time to just stand up. You don't got to stay standing the whole time, but take the time to stand up. I know it sounds super old fashioned, like, well, we're not in some tribe, or this is what our clan does, but that's just it. The Bible was giving a simple thing, because that is a sign of respect. It's what do you do at a wedding when the bride shows up in the back? Everyone stands,
That's actually, honestly, might be my favorite part of the wedding ceremony.
It's moving, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah, because it means something. It's kind of like, when a lady comes in the room, I try to stand. And I think I started doing that more when I read this. Not that all ladies are elderly, but there is something that used to be a custom in the West, and there's a reason it was. Because here's the thing. Okay, let's say we don't stand anymore. Then what do we do? It's kind of like we've taken something that showed some respect to the elderly and have replaced it with nothing. It'd be one thing if we had replaced it with something else, but it's so why did it really disappear? Was it because it's inconvenient? Personally, I think it kind of disappeared because a dedication to respect sort of evaporated.
Yeah.
Now I'm not saying that's something you have to do, but I let me say this. Going back to our first point, what does this do for you? I can sincerely say, for me, it's upped my level of respect for the older people. I'm mindful now when they show up.
I grew up primarily in Texas. I'm talking about during my formative, middle school, high school, teenage years.
Okay.
And man, it was a big deal. And I know it is in the South. So for our non-U.S. listeners, the South being like historically South, the North-South, what the Civil War was fought over. So you're talking about Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Who am I leaving out? Arkansas. You said yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Like that was a given, and I don't hear it the way you hear it some, but it's not to the degree that it used to be.
Right.
And I've seen. Now this is definitely anecdotal. This is certainly not science, but I was watching a YouTube clip one time of an older guy going around talking to older people, and a theme emerged from them, which is they didn't feel valued. Like they didn't feel not even just respected, but like valued, like that they had anything to contribute, which is ironic because God himself makes the case that they're amongst your most valuable community members.
Right. And actually that is where we could move to being a little more active. And that is you honor older people. One way to do that is by talking with them, actually not just recognizing they're there at a distance or they're, but actually say at services, just to pick an example. We're not just talking about honoring only older people at services, but it's an easy place to go because you'll probably have some. Taking the time to not just talk with your comfortable group or those that you would normally speak with, but actually taking the time to greet Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so and engage them in conversation. Yeah. Now, sometimes people, and we used to teach at camp, I'm not sure if they still do anymore, we used to teach how to have a conversation. There's a great book on that. It sounds like a nerdy thing to do, read a book on how to talk to people, but I recommend it all the time by a man named Don Gabor, and I think it's titled How to Have a Conversation and Make Friends, which sounds it sounds I really don't want to get a book like that, but I tell you, it's a good book.
Well, you did a presentation at the winter weekend.
Oh, I did. That's right.
Where you had a lot of those principles in there.
I did.
Of course, you went to a very young man to get examples of what
that was awesome.
That was very well done.
That went really well. And we had photos of the young guys staying at our house reenacting all the advice. Yeah. That was great. That was the Charlotte Family Weekend. That was just this last one, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, take the time. So if you don't really know what to talk about, then just go with some kind of questions thinking that you might ask. And you don't have to commit to, I'm going to ask all of them, like I'm going to grill them like they're in prison or something. Yeah. But there's so many things you can ask about. You can ask about how their family is doing, what their week was like, find out if they have any hobbies, ask about their time in the church. Yeah. One of the things I wish we did more is get in touch with people like, well, how did you come into the church? And hear some of those stories. I want to suggest this. I wouldn't start it as make the first thing you say is to go up and say, hi, well, how is life different for you now than it was, or different for us now than it was when you were younger? But that's kind of the nice thing is once you do start building a relationship, and by the way, small talk is the grease that gears, the grease that lubricates the gears of relationships. I'll put that. And so, yeah, you start off with some small talk, but over time, when you've talked every once in a while and you do kind of want to know, you can ask, hey, at school things are like this for me. Did you ever have anything like that growing up? And man, get a discussion on how there really was a different world back then. But it all starts with starting to make conversation of some sort.
Listen, this group is getting smaller and smaller, but I guarantee you, I won't make a guarantee. There's a high degree of probability that if you talk to somebody, say in their 80s, it is possible that when they were kids, the first part of their life, that they grew up without electricity in the home or without plumbing in the home. I was amazed at my previous job. That's now 12 years ago. I worked with a guy who grew up without any kind of air conditioning, electricity, and they actually literally bathed in the creek.
Wow.
So that's another example of like what gets lost here in our modern community. We just think everybody. Whoever lived had electricity and indoor plumbing, and then you do a little bit of research and find out, no, a very, very tiny percentage of people who've ever lived have had the modern conveniences we have. So I have one last comment that I don't know what else I would add, but this thing about saying sir, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, the funny, I think Ernest Hemingway thing, how did you go bankrupt? Well, gradually and then suddenly. It's like, when did you become old? How did you, and it's like, well, at first gradually and then suddenly. And one of the ways I noticed was just exchanges with people out in public, younger people. And I started getting called sir more often. And I knew if I was getting called sir, I was like, okay, we're not fooling anyone anymore. We're not a young man. There really is somewhere, there's a gray area where you transition from a young man into a middle-aged or older man, and it's different for everybody, but it's over when people start calling you sir.
Oh, that's funny. I remember I was giving my son a ride home from work. There was a time when Benjamin was working at the Amazon warehouse for money, help pay his way through college, and it was the crazy early shift, as in like we're bringing him home at 4 or 5 in the morning. He was getting there at 8 the night before, but he didn't have a car yet, so we're picking him up. And I just turned 50, I think. So yeah, you're only looking at what 4 years ago. I'm old enough now. I got to think about it. And I can't remember if he brought it up or I brought it up, but I'll just assume I brought it up and said, well, hey, I just turned 50. What do you think about that? He said, oh yeah, we were talking about that. And he said, yeah. He says, we're talking about it how the 50s are a good, cool old age. They said, it's like you're officially old. He said, but it's just old enough that people can assume you really know what you're doing, and that's really good. And I thought, oh, well, that's nice to be that kind of old. But at the same time, I'm living the 50s, and I know how much, whether I know what I'm doing or not. Versus the way he described that, I think of the guys in their 60s and their 70s. That those are guys who not only know what they're doing, but have had time to make sure they're doing it, really well. But that said, yeah, let's maybe we should wrap up with that. In terms of talking to older people, the nice thing about once you start talking with them, you start building a bit of a relationship, is that once you have a relationship, it's a lot easier to start asking for advice. And that's kind of when I think you've crossed really into the territory where you not only honor them by going to them for advice. I think Mr. Jonathan Monero was talking about a culture, I think in Japan or something, that even when they have CEOs who are, say, retirement age, they still kind of retain a certain access to them because they recognize these are the people we want to talk to. These are the people we want to make sure we access for opinions and advice. But when you have that kind of relationship, then it becomes a lot more natural to be able to sit down with someone, and you'd be surprised at the relationship advice they can give. It's easy to look at someone and not recognize just how much life they have lived in detail. In fact, maybe I'll wrap up with this. We're about done with Dr. Meredith's autobiography. I finally did the final review. It's just taken me a while to go through.
Nobody believes us.
Yeah, no, they don't. But in this last review that I did, It was so good to read through it in detail again. And it was shocking is the wrong word. Dr. Meredith, you can tell the man had really lived some life, but it's easy to think of that life as starting at Ambassador College because he was young. I mean, he went to Ambassador College. He's been a part of the work from young days. However, it's just astonishing, and I encourage all of our younger readers, when you get this, because you will get it because we're finishing it and getting into the printer, when you get Dr. Meredith's autobiography, take the time to read it. How much life he lived and experience he had, even going through high school and the rest. It was just a reminder that as much as I did go to Dr. Meredith for advice and counsel here and there, because by then I was recognized, I need to reach out to guys like that. I wish I'd talked to him about even more. Mm-hmm. I wish I had tapped into the resource that he represented even more than I did. So I would encourage you when you get that autobiography to read it, and hopefully all of this has done you some good, and you will focus more on thinking yourself, how can I honor the hoary head around me, if you will? How can I honor the white-headed and the elderly? Because we guarantee you, God doesn't command you to do that for his good or even for their good, though it is for their good, but he's commanding that of you for your good. And you will find that it makes the kind of good that doesn't just last for this lifetime, but actually will last on into eternity.